Hello everyone, I'm Dan, and today we're going to be talking a bit about garbage collection in Fusion. Now, this is something that I am still working on a fully formed solution for, but today I'm specifically going to be addressing the reference losing problem. So for those of you who aren't familiar with that problem, I'd just like to walk you through it very quickly. So one thing that Fusion lets you do is it lets you take a variable, so we'll call this, I don't know, color, and you can bind it to a thing. So we're going to bind this to the color of a part in the workspace, right? And so when color is red, then the part turns red. When you set it to blue, the part turns blue, etc., etc., etc. But you can run into a problem really easily, and here's how. So we're going to change this from color to parent, right? So parent, and this parent is currently workspace. So we'll do WS for workspace. And so in the data model, we have WS for workspace, and the part is parented to there, right? I guess we'll get rid of this arrow as well. We'll rewrite this. So say parent equals WS, and that sets the part's parent to workspace. Now notice something about this here in our code, right? Is that we aren't holding a reference to the instance, but we can still have an effect on it because Fusion is managing all of that for us. So we could lose the reference to this part in our script, right? We could just totally let it fall out of scope. We don't even need to know where the part is. All we need is this parent variable, and we can affect its behavior. So now consider what happens when we parent it to nil, right? So we set parent equal to nil. So instead of being parented under the workspace, this is now parented under nil, like so. And let's now think about what exactly we've done here. So this part is now in nil, so it is no longer accessible via any data model. You can't do game dot anything, right? You can't do that. Can't do script dot anything, right? You can't access it from there. Or even plugin, right? Because plugins also exist. Plugin dot anything, you can't access it. There is no way that you could get a reference to this part in Lua. At least not via the data model. You'd have to have the reference already. But we don't have a reference. We only have a reference to the parent variable. And so this leads us to a very interesting problem, which is that this part has no references, no strong references anyway, and we can't get a reference because it's not accessible. So this part should be garbage collected. Except that is not intuitive, and the reason why, if we just quickly undo all of this stuff, is we could set that parent variable back to workspace, right? So set it back to WS, and we would then expect the part to just happily move back from nil into workspace. So this is a problem. And there is no real easy solution for this because, well, when you destroy a part intentionally, you're basically doing exactly the same thing, but you're just promising to never touch it again, right? When you want to destroy something, like when you call the destroy method, so destroy, in my terrible handwriting, what you're actually doing is you're just disconnecting all the event handlers, which essentially frees up a bunch of references that you would otherwise be holding on to. And then what does it do? Is it sets the parent to nil. Right? So yeah, we'll just erase that. Why is it doing that? That's weird. I don't like the new whiteboard, it sucks. I should find a replacement. But yeah, so how do we solve this problem? And I've been thinking about this a little bit. And the conclusion that I've come to is that we can't continue supporting nil parenting. We just can't, because nil is overloaded with function. When we are talking about nil parenting like this, we are talking about two things, and they are two different things. One of these is temporary, so temporary parenting, like so. But the other thing we're talking about is destruction, like so. And so nil kind of has two purposes, and we can't figure out which one the user intends when they move something into nil. So what do we do about this? And my answer is that temporary parenting should not be done in nil. And that whenever you have something that you want to reuse later, you should keep it somewhere else. The question then becomes where? Because there is no real good place to put things that you don't want to use right now, but which don't belong anywhere else. You could parent it under the script, but what if that's something that affects the behavior of a script? What if you have other modules under there? What if you have a naming conflict? You could parent it under lighting, but what if your thing is a post-process effect or something? Well, now suddenly you have an extra post-process effect. Really, I think we need a dedicated place to put things that don't have a parent. Things that it would be incorrect to parent anywhere else, but which it would also be incorrect to parent to nil because they aren't ready to be destroyed yet. And so this is where I propose the addition of a new instance called an orphanage. So orphanage, name open to bike shedding because that is quite a mouthful. So an orphanage would be used to handle instances that don't have a home. The instances that have been just unceremoniously ripped from the data model, but don't really have a destination. They aren't destined to be destroyed, but they aren't destined to exist anywhere either. They just kind of are there. And so I propose that things in Fusion such as computed on parent or the unparenting behavior of children should use the orphanage instead of nil, because I want to change nil to have a definite definition, and that definite definition is destruction. So what would this look like? Well, firstly, like the very first thing I would do is I would say you can't use nil inside of a parent computed anymore. If you try and pass nil to the parent property of an instance, Fusion will just error. It will say, you're not allowed to do that because you're not allowed to destroy something via parent. And the reason why, like at first you might think, oh, but why would you do that? Because that would be a really convenient way to destroy something without having to use imperative code. Maybe it would be, but also at the same time, it's too much of a minefield. Because there's going to be existing code bases that are going to suffer from, this behavior change with no warning. You're just going to suddenly realize, hey, all these things that I was parenting to nil are suddenly just disappearing, and there's no trace of why they would be doing that. But then there's also, for example, is this even a good idea? Because the entire point of binding to properties is to control only that property, right? It's about piping something directly in. It's about one sole purpose. We would basically be making parent have two purposes there. The first purpose being choosing where it's located, and the second purpose being determining the lifetime of the instance, which I'm not very keen on. I mean, we could possibly do that, but it couldn't be by setting parent to nil. It'd have to be some other kind of mechanism, because nil, we're basically changing the behavior of setting the parent of an instance to nil from what it is in Roblox, which is something I always want to avoid. So we do not want to break convention. So we'll just write that down like that. And so that's the first thing I want to do, is basically say no parenting to nil for destruction. We would advocate for the use of destroy, as we already do. And the second thing would be that anything in Fusion that would have previously parented to nil will now parent to the orphanage instead. So we'll just use these really cool colors for Fusion. So Fusion, like that. Basically, I think this is a good enough solution for version 0.2 because this should solve all of the garbage collection problems. But there are some questions about this, obviously. The first big question is, what if something is orphaned? So, what if something is my pen selected? Oh my god. Can I write, please? Please, hello? No, I can't. Okay, whatever. But basically, the first problem is that what if something is orphaned forever? So let's say, for example, we have an instance and we passed it into children via a state object, and then we just decided to just unset the state object. So the instance is no longer in that state object. So child will unparent it and move it into the orphanage, at which point it's just going to chill there forever, and we're not going to do anything with it. We'll just lose all of our references, and we'll just never touch it ever again. Like, no properties bound to it whatsoever. That's a very real problem, and I don't really have a good solution for that right now. I did consider tracking the references of things in the orphanage, so if something loses all of its references, then you can't garbage collect it. At which point I then realized that we're back to square one with this problem, and if you just, bound to parent in an orphanage, then you don't have to have a reference to the thing in the orphanage in order to get it out. So what I might end up doing with the orphanage is sort of, if you bind to parent on something in an orphanage, we would just not touch it. And that could be good enough. I mean, it definitely solves for the one thing, but it does also mean that we now have this extra special case. I think we'll have to be fine with that for version 0.2 because we are way over schedule with releasing this thing, and I'm kind of don't want to delay even more just working on this garbage collection problem. But we should definitely look into more explicit ways of managing instance lifetimes than garbage collection because it's not really fit for purpose here. But on the plus side though, adopting this solution for v0.2 means that you can basically write code the way that you have always done in Fusion, and most of the time, like 9 times out of 10, it will now work perfectly, right? Like, as long as you don't bind to parent and then just not manually destroy, you'll be fine. Because if you don't manually bind to parent, then we can use reference counting as a valid strategy for cleaning up things in the orphanage. And because we have this orphanage, we know specifically that this is not meant to be destroyed. And so we have all of the assertions in place to be able to be confident that we can clean this thing up. The only sort of asterisk then is if there's something in the orphanage which has a bound parent property, or could otherwise, be moved without having a reference to the instance. That's when we run into the problems with this technique. And that's the unsolved question. And that is something that probably won't be solved within this framework of thinking. So I've been talking to lots of people. I've been talking with like Quenty and other people about where do we go from this system to something a bit more explicit and something that is a bit more, something we can make more rigid assertions about when it comes to lifetimes of instances and when things are destroyed versus when things are temporarily relocated. I have been thinking about disallowing this kind of temporary relocation entirely and moving Fusion much more towards the realm of templating, like in terms of like, instead of dealing with like physical instances, you are basically dealing with instances as if they are templates. A more ROACT way of thinking about it, right? But of course, not adopting a virtual data model because we don't have to do that here. Right? The virtual data model is used for diffing, not for garbage collection. We don't have to do diffing because we directly bind to properties. But it would still be adopting the ROACT way of thinking about UI in terms of instances that are created and destroyed, not moved. But these are all really big questions, which I have really no big thoughts on at the moment. But this is about as good as we could hope for V0.2, so I'm happy with this solution. So hopefully you will be too. I will wait for feedback on this before I implement this because I want to be sure that you guys are on board with it as well. So let me know what you think in the comments. Let me know in Discord, on Twitter, wherever. Just, I don't know, send letters to me or carrier pigeons. I don't know. But yeah, that's basically everything I have. So thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you guys very, very soon. Have fun.